Hello, Biology 103. This is Professor Willis speaking. Welcome to tonight's lab, which is Lab 6, and it is on Mendelian Genetics. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin, you should probably know a little bit about Mendelian genetics. So the reason why it is called this is because in 1857 there was an Austrian monk, and he was fascinated with plants and botany. So he decided to set up some experiments with pea plants. And so he took these pea plants and he grew them in the monastery's garden, and he started doing crosses with them. So he started mating them and looking at the different flower colors and what would happen if he crossed them. And so after doing a series of experiments, he noticed that there definitely was some sort of pattern of inheritance. The offspring of the pea plant parents definitely had similar characteristics and traits. Now, at that time, he knew nothing about DNA. He knew nothing about genes and alleles and things that we're going to talk about tonight. But he did notice that there was heredity that occurred, that things did pass on to the offspring. And he called these discrete units of inheritance. And from this, we then discovered things like genes and DNA, and we used Punnett squares to predict the probability of these outcomes. So here is an introduction to very basic genetics. Okay, so you inherit traits, right, from your parents. Well, those traits are what we call genes. And a gene is simply a sequence of DNA that codes for that trait. Okay, so you have tons of genes in your cells. Okay, so there are tons of different sequences of DNA that will code for traits that make you. Okay, so on these genes, there can be different versions, okay? And these different versions are what we call alleles. And depending upon what you inherit, right, from your parents, they can either be dominant alleles or recessive alleles. So sometimes you get the dominant versions of the gene, and sometimes you get the recessive versions of the gene. So it really just depends, and it's totally random upon what you inherit. Now, you will usually only inherit two alleles, okay, one from your mother and one from your father. So again, a gene is simply a sequence of DNA, and there are different versions, and those versions are what we call alleles, and there are dominant ones and recessive ones. Now, you may have noticed that I put little letters next to dominant and recessive, and that is because when we represent the dominant allele or the recessive allele, we tend to use capital letters for the dominant allele and lowercase letters for the recessive allele. When you inherit dominant alleles from both parents, so for example, father gave you the dominant allele, mother gave you the dominant allele, you are termed homozygous dominant for that gene, for that trait. Okay, and again, when we're representing that with letters, when we do our predictions, we use both uppercases. So I just gave you an example here of big A, or uppercase A, uppercase A. That means you inherited the one dominant from one parent and the other dominant allele from the other parent. So we call you homozygous dominant. If you inherit one dominant allele from one parent and a recessive allele from another parent, we call you heterozygous for that trait. And it really doesn't matter which parent gives you what, as long as you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele for that trait, you are termed heterozygous. Now, if you receive alleles from both parents that are recessive, then you are termed homozygous recessive. So if mom gives you a recessive allele and dad gives you the recessive allele, then we term you homozygous recessive. In case you don't know what the difference is between dominant and recessive, when you inherit the dominant trait like we see in Mendelian genetics, that means you're going to express that trait. We're going to see it in what you look like, or your phenotype, it's called. Okay, but If you inherit recessive copies of that trait, then you will express the recessive version of the trait. Okay, so anytime you inherit the dominant allele in Mendelian genetics, the idea is that you will show the dominant allele. But when the dominant allele is not present, you will show the recessive. Here you can see an image, a visual, that shows the difference between homozygous and heterozygous on a chromosome. So, for example, on the left, homozygous again means you inherited the same type of allele, and heterozygous means you didn't. You inherited one of the dominant and one of the recessive. Something that scientists do to show the patterns of inheritance and who is dominant and who is recessive and what happens when mating occurs. Well, they use these things called pedigrees. And pedigrees are charts that are used to analyze genetic relationships. So if this person mates with this person and they have a child, what are the chances of them inheriting that trait? It definitely shows who may be homozygous or heterozygous for traits, and I'll show you how this works. The rules for pedigree making are quite simple. If you are a female in the family that you are tracing, you are represented as a circle. And if you're a male, you are represented as a square. And when you draw a horizontal line connecting the male and the female, and then you drop a line down from that, that means they mated, so they had offspring. And you can diagram those on the next line down. Dropping the vertical line down from the horizontal one indicates that the parents had children. So here you can see the first generation is at the top and there are two parents. We see that there is a female and a male and they're connected together with the horizontal line. However, you see a vertical line that kind of drops with a new bracket, and that bracket represents their children. So you can see here these three children. There's one male and two females. So remember how I said that pedigrees are used to track genetic relationships? Well, whatever trait you are tracing in this family, when you shade in the person, that means they are expressing that trait. That means whatever you're kind of tracking, that person has it. So for example, in your online lab today, the first scenario will involve tongue rolling. So what you want to do is shade in anyone that that doesn't roll their tongue, okay? If they're not shaded, that means they don't express that trait, okay? And then if they're a half shade, that means they're heterozygous. That means they're carrying the trait, but they're not necessarily expressing it, okay? In this lab this week, you are going to be constructing pedigrees of two different families. And you're going to be tracing a specific trait that is found in that family through time. So you'll be required to make a pedigree, and then you're going to try to determine the pattern of inheritance through that family pedigree. Two scenarios will be presented to you. For each of the scenarios, you need to construct a pedigree of that family and their situation. Make sure you follow the rules that we just learned about in the previous slides of this PowerPoint. So biological males are square, biological females are circle, connect them together, drop a line down if they have offspring. I think the easiest thing to do would be to make the pedigree on a sheet of paper, take a picture of it, and insert that picture into your online lab. You can also make these digitally if you prefer it that way. Just make sure that whatever way you do it, follow the labeling rules and requirements that are in the lab. So they are asking you to identify what individual is what and what are their alleles. And then after that, there's just one question for each scenario, and the question is the same. It asks you to explain how this trait was passed on through the family. When you are done, just make sure you submit it to Blackboard, turn it in by next Monday by 5:30 p.m. and just check your work to make sure that it actually is submitted. All right, everyone, that concludes this week's lab. I will see you later. Bye.